All right, let's talk about one of the most secretive, revered, and unsettling forces in all of Warhammer 40k, the Grey Knights. From the outside, they seem like the epitome of everything the Imperium holds sacred. Psychic warriors without corruption, a brotherhood forged in silence and suffering, dedicated solely to the eradication of chaos. No one knows their names, no records exist of their deeds, and yet they're whispered about in the darkest halls of the Inquisition, feared even by those who fight alongside them. They are the final wall between the galaxy and complete demonic annihilation, or so we're told. But the deeper you dig, the more the pristine image starts to crack. Because for all their so-called purity, there's something deeply unsettling about the Grey Knights. They operate outside every structure of oversight. They destroy allies to protect their secrets. They wield weapons forged from the very essence of the warp. And perhaps most chilling of all, no one ever questions them. Not the High Lords, not the Inquisition, not even the Ecclesiarchy dares to challenge their authority. So, the question begins to form, slowly and disturbingly. Are they truly pure? Or have they become the very thing they claim to hate? A cult cloaked in silver, wielding faith like a weapon, operating with absolute certainty that they alone know the truth. In this video, we're going to pull back the layers on the Grey Knights, everything from their origins to their mindset, their rituals to their secrets, and we'll try to answer the question that's been gnawing at fans for years. Are the Grey Knights truly the purest defenders of mankind, or just the most dangerous cult the Imperium has ever created? The origin of the Grey Knights is one of those moments in Warhammer lore that feels more like myth than history. It's not just shrouded in secrecy, it's buried under layers of silence, lies, and forbidden truths. And maybe that's what makes it so compelling. Because when you start tracing their roots, you don't end up with just another chapter of Space Marines. You find yourself at the end of the Horus Heresy, in the ashes of the galaxy's greatest betrayal, with the Emperor broken and bleeding on the Golden Throne, and the Imperium barely hanging on. That's where the story of the Grey Knights begins, not in triumph, but in desperation. According to the scattered fragments of lore we are allowed to see, it all starts with Malcador the Sigillite, the Emperor's right hand, a psyker of unimaginable power, and one of the few individuals in the entire galaxy who truly grasped the existential threat of chaos. While the heresy raged, while brother slaughtered brother and demons poured into real space, Malcador was already thinking ahead. He knew that even if they won the war, chaos wasn't going anywhere. You can't kill a god with bolter fire. You can't burn an idea with flame. Chaos had to be fought on a different level, one of faith, psychic might, and absolute inner strength. So Malcador gathered 8 men, 8 warriors, handpicked not just for their martial prowess, but for their incorruptibility. We still don't know who all of them were. Some names have been hinted at. Nathaniel Garrow, the knight-errant of the Death Guard, is often speculated to be among them. But the truth is, that part of the lore is intentionally vague, perhaps even mythologized on purpose. It adds to the cultish feel around the Grey Knights. Their founders aren't just lost to history. They were never meant to be known. That's how deep the secrecy goes. The most fascinating part of this origin story is the intention behind it. The Grey Knights weren't just meant to be Space Marines who fight demons. The Imperium already had thousands of those. They were meant to be more, flawless, incorruptible, immune to the very temptations that had torn the galaxy apart. The idea wasn't just to create strong warriors, it was to create perfect ones. And that's where things get a little unsettling. Because when you start designing warriors to be perfect, you're no longer dealing with just tactics or genetics. You're dealing with ideology. You're creating a belief system, an inner code that can't be broken, not even by reality. And in the case of the Grey Knights, that belief system was forged in the idea of absolute purity. No room for doubt, no tolerance for failure, no compromise. Now, this is where some fans get really divided. Some believe the Grey Knights were a necessary evil, that in a galaxy this messed up, You need a force like them, something so dedicated, so incorruptible, that it can stare into the heart of the warp and not blink. Others see it differently. They argue that the very act of trying to engineer purity like this is inherently dangerous. That what began as a noble goal has become a form of extremism. And honestly, I get both sides, because when you look at how the Grey Knights were built, it's clear that they were never supposed to be just another tool of the Imperium. They were supposed to stand above it all, beyond politics, beyond dogma, beyond even the Emperor's own failures. That's why they were hidden. That's why their existence is erased from records. They aren't just warriors. They're a safeguard against the corruption of the Imperium itself. There's also a theory, one of my favorites actually, that the Grey Knights weren't just created to fight demons, but to be a counterbalance to the Inquisition. Think about it. An organization like the Inquisition, with absolute authority and no oversight, is terrifying. What if it falls to corruption? Who polices the Inquisition? Well, maybe the Grey Knights do. Quietly, without fanfare. A sword in the shadows, pointed even at their own allies if needed. But of course, that kind of unchecked power is a double-edged sword. The very thing that makes the Grey Knights so effective, their secrecy, their autonomy, their ideological purity, is also what makes them so hard to trust. They weren't born out of hope. They were born out of fear. Fear of chaos. Fear of corruption. Fear that humanity couldn't be trusted with its own survival unless something perfect was watching over it. And perfection, as we've all learned from Warhammer time and time again, comes at a price. Now here's where things get really weird, and honestly, kind of chilling. Most Space Marines are created using the genetic legacy of one of the 20 Primarchs. You take the gene seed of a demigod, you implant it into recruits, and over time you get a new generation of enhanced warriors, each carrying a sliver of their progenitor's essence. It's not a perfect system, far from it, but that's the model the Imperium has used since the Great Crusade. But the Grey Knights? They broke the mold entirely, because their gene seed doesn't come from any of the Primarchs, not even from someone like Roboot Guilliman or Rogel Dorn, the so-called loyal ones. No, the Grey Knights are believed to be made from the genetic material of Malcador the Sigillite himself. Yeah, let that sink in for a moment. Malcador wasn't a Primarch. He wasn't even a Space Marine. But he was the Emperor's most trusted ally, and according to some sources, his psychic power was second only to the Emperor himself. He was a blank slate in some ways. No pride, no ambition, just raw, terrifying intelligence and unwavering loyalty. If you were looking for a source of incorruptible genes, I guess Malcador is about as close as it gets. But it also raises a lot of uncomfortable questions, like how do you even harvest a gene seed from someone like Malcador? Did he consent to it? Was it part of some grand plan? Or did the Emperor or someone else just take that legacy and use it without a second thought, driven by desperation in the wake of the heresy? There's a kind of clinical horror to that idea, that the foundation of the purest chapter in the Imperium might have been built on the sacrifice of a man who had already given everything. Some fans believe Malcador didn't just offer his genetic legacy. He became part of the Grey Knights in a more spiritual sense, that his psychic signature still echoes through the chapter. Every battle brother, in theory, carries a trace of his will, his mind. And if that's true, it would explain why the Grey Knights are so different. Not just stronger or more disciplined, but psychologically unique. They don't crack under pressure like other Astartes. They don't fall to pride or vengeance. It's like they were wired from the start to resist everything that tore the galaxy apart. And that resistance? It's not just theoretical. There's never been a single recorded instance of a Grey Knight falling to chaos. Not one. In a setting where everyone eventually breaks, that fact alone is almost supernatural. Either the gene seed is truly that pure, or something else is going on behind the scenes. There are even conspiracy theories that the Grey Knights aren't just enhanced with Malcador's genes, but that the Emperor himself played a hand in their creation on a metaphysical level, like literally infused them with his divine essence. Think about it. The Emperor is half myth already, a being suspended between life and death, godhood and humanity. If he wanted to create an army that could never fall to chaos, maybe he had to transcend normal genecraft. Maybe he imbued the Grey Knights with something more like a soul fragment. It's wild speculation, of course, but this is Warhammer. We deal in the grim and the absurd. And there's another side to this purity that's worth talking about, what it costs. Because yes, they're resistant to chaos. Yes, they're psychically disciplined. But there's something deeply inhuman about them. Other Space Marines at least pretend to feel loyalty, camaraderie, brotherhood. The Grey Knights? They don't even try. They're monastic, stoic, emotionally muted. They don't form bonds the same way. It's like the purity that protects them also isolates them from the rest of humanity, and maybe even from themselves. There's this popular fan theory I've always loved, tragic but beautiful in its own way, that the Grey Knights aren't immune to corruption because they're better, but because they're hollow. That they've been stripped of something essential in order to be immune. Not corrupted, but sanitized, empty. They don't dream. They don't desire. They just exist to kill demons and keep their secrets. And that's not a warrior. That's a weapon. So when people say the Grey Knights are pure, I always ask, pure compared to what? Because maybe they are. Maybe genetically, psychically, spiritually, they're the most untainted warriors the Imperium has ever produced. But that doesn't necessarily make them noble. That doesn't make them human. If anything, it makes them something else entirely. And sometimes I wonder if that's what Malcador really intended. Not to save humanity, but to create something that would endure long after humanity was gone. Something that could survive in the ashes. If you've spent any time digging into the Grey Knights, you'll notice something strange almost immediately. Nobody talks about them. Not in a hushed reverence kind of way, but like they've been surgically removed from the conversation entirely. No mention in records, no public honors. Even most Imperial commanders don't know they exist. And if they do, they're warned to forget. That level of secrecy isn't just intense, it's pathological. And it tells you a lot about their relationship with the one organization that not only knows about them, but essentially owns them, the Inquisition. Specifically, the Ordo Malleus. The Ordo Malleus was created to combat demonic threats, and from the beginning, the Grey Knights were meant to be their ultimate weapon. It's not a partnership of equals. It's more like a leash and the beast at the end of it. But the weird thing is, the leash doesn't seem to go both ways. Grey Knights follow the orders of Inquisitors, but only certain ones. Only those they deem worthy. And when a Grey Knight deems you unworthy, you don't get a second opinion. You disappear. There's a kind of mutual suspicion that defines the whole relationship. The Inquisition trusts the Grey Knights to get the job done, sure, but they don't really trust them. Not fully. And the feeling is mutual. It's like two snakes circling each other, both knowing the other might be necessary, but never forgetting the venom. There are cases where Inquisitors have tried to dig too deep into Titan, the Grey Knights' home world, or access their libraries, and they just vanish. Not executed, not tried, just gone. That's the level we're talking about. Some fans see this as a sign of strength, that the Grey Knights are so dedicated to their mission, they don't even allow the Inquisition itself to interfere. But to me, it feels more like paranoia. Not unjustified paranoia. This is the Imperium, after all. But still, it reeks of a cult's need to control the narrative. To shut every window, bolt every door, and never let even their allies see what goes on inside. Their isolation isn't just strategic, it's cultural. They don't recruit from other chapters. They don't form alliances. They don't engage in diplomacy. Even other loyalist forces only ever encounter them during crises, and when it's over, the Grey Knights don't stick around for thanks or debriefs. They leave behind scorched earth and a trail of silenced witnesses, sometimes literally. If you survive a battle alongside the Grey Knights, there's a good chance you'll be executed or mind-wiped just for seeing them. And that raises a serious question. What are they hiding? The obvious answer is that they're protecting humanity from dangerous knowledge, that even knowing the truth about chaos can open the door to corruption, and that makes sense to a point. But there's a darker theory among some fans, and honestly, I can't shake it. What if they're not just hiding the enemy, but hiding themselves? Not because they're ashamed, but because what they are is so radically different from the rest of the Imperium, so alien in thought and purpose, that exposure would destroy the illusion of unity. Their connection to the Ordo Malleus gives them legal cover, sure, but it also places them in a weird liminal space. They're not part of the Adeptus Astartes command structure. They don't answer to the High Lords. And the Ecclesiarchy, despite all its posturing about spiritual purity, has no say in what the Grey Knights do. They operate on an entirely separate axis of power, one built on the authority of fear, faith, and psychic supremacy. Some people argue this is exactly what makes them effective, that the warp can't be fought with conventional tools, so we need something extraordinary, something separate from the Imperium's bureaucratic cancer. But I've always been a bit uneasy with that logic, because when you create an organization that exists entirely in the shadows, that answers to no one, that is allowed to kill allies to protect its secrets, you're not building Guardians, you're building Dogma, and Dogma doesn't care who it burns. And then there's the question of Titan. The Grey Knights' fortress monastery is on Saturn's moon, surrounded by wards and psychic barriers so dense that even most Inquisitors aren't allowed near it. The idea is that it must be protected at all costs, because it contains artifacts, records, weapons too dangerous to ever be shared. But the thing is, secrecy like that always breeds suspicion. What kind of weapons exactly? What kind of records? What truths are so volatile that even the Imperium can't be trusted with them? It's not just protection anymore, it's self-preservation. And to me, that's where the cult-like behavior starts to really show. A real organization of justice doesn't erase history. A real force of good doesn't kill the witnesses. But a cult? A cult thrives in silence. A cult needs darkness to survive. So the deeper I go into their connection with the Ordo Malleus, the more I start to wonder, are the Grey Knights the Inquisition's greatest asset, or their greatest liability? Because if purity requires this much secrecy, this much control, this much silence, maybe it's not purity at all. Maybe it's just fear, dressed in silver. If there's one thing that sets the Grey Knights apart more than anything else, it's their psychic nature. Every single one of them is a psyker. No exceptions, no variations, no middle ground. And not just minor telepaths or battlefield seers either. We're talking about highly trained, weaponized minds capable of resisting demons, not just with bolters and swords, but with sheer willpower. In a galaxy where even a glimpse of the warp can drive someone insane, these guys stare into it daily. They don't just fight chaos, they invade it. And honestly, that's terrifying. The kind of mental discipline required to do what they do is hard to even comprehend. Other chapters have a few librarians here and there, maybe one or two psychers in a whole company. But for the Grey Knights, psychic ability is the foundation. It's woven into their training, their combat doctrine, even their theology. They're warriors of the mind as much as the body. But here's the thing. Being a psyker in the Warhammer universe isn't like casting magic in a fantasy setting. It's not clean or beautiful. It's invasive, dangerous, and exhausting. Every psychic act opens a window to the warp. Every spell, every ward, every telekinetic strike carries a risk. That's why their training is so brutal. It has to be. These guys undergo rituals and trials that would kill normal humans, and probably most space marines too. We're talking about soul-binding, mental combat against demons, psychic duels that take place entirely inside their minds. And if you lose, it's not just death, it's worse. You get consumed, body and soul. You become what you were meant to fight. So failure isn't just unacceptable, it's unthinkable. Some of the rituals are so intense, they sound like something out of a nightmare. There's one where a recruit must relive their worst memories over and over, while a demon tries to warp them into something else. The only way to pass is to remain unchanged, to hold on to your identity like a lifeline. And that's not even the final test. That's just one step in a staircase built on pain, fear, and isolation. And yet, somehow, they don't just survive it, they embrace it. The Grey Knights see these rituals as necessary acts of purification. They believe that only by confronting chaos directly, psychically, spiritually, can they build the mental walls needed to resist it. But the cost is staggering. They don't think like other people. Their minds are hyper-focused, drilled into patterns of control, suppression, and purpose. You start to wonder, what do they lose in the process? There's a sense among some fans that the Grey Knights aren't really men anymore, not in the emotional sense. They've been hollowed out and rebuilt as psychic weapons, not cruel, not malicious, but emotionally distant in a way that feels almost tragic. There are stories about initiates who went too far during the rituals, who came back cold, mechanical, disconnected, still loyal, still pure, but empty. Like something got burned out of them and never came back. And yet, paradoxically, they're deeply spiritual, not in the same way as the ecclesiarchy with its saints and relics, but in their own psychic mysticism. They believe in purity, not just as a virtue, but as a shield. Their very names are wards. Their chants are weapons. Their armor is etched with sigils not for decoration, but for psychic resonance. Everything about them is designed to repel the warp, not just physically, but existentially. One of the more haunting elements of their psychic discipline is their use of the Emperor's name. Unlike the ecclesiarchy, which worships him as a god, the Grey Knights treat his name like a weapon, a psychic anchor. They use it in battle, in rituals, in their psychic assaults. When they channel the Emperor's will, they're not just invoking faith, they're weaponizing belief. And in a universe where belief shapes reality, that's not just metaphor, it's real. There's this fan theory I really like. It's kind of grim, but it fits. The idea is that the Grey Knights don't resist demons because they're immune to corruption, but because their entire psychic identity is built around one idea: I am not like you. Every moment of their training reinforces that divide. Every ritual is a wall, and over time, they become so alien to chaos that the warp can't even understand them anymore. Not because they're above it, but because they've denied every part of themselves that chaos could latch onto. But that kind of denial doesn't come without consequences. When you spend your life building walls inside your own mind, eventually you have to wonder, what's on the other side? Who are you without the rituals, the chants, the purity? Do the Grey Knights even know? Or have they become so entangled in their own psychic conditioning that they've forgotten what it means to be anything else? It's one of the reasons I find them so compelling. They're not just warriors, they're psychological fortresses, and yet every fortress has cracks. Every wall can crumble, given enough time. The Grey Knights might be the most mentally disciplined force in the Imperium, but that discipline comes at a cost. It's built on trauma, repetition, denial, and somewhere, buried under all that psychic steel, there might still be a person. But you'd need to tear down a universe's worth of defenses just to find them. One of the most paradoxical and honestly unsettling things about the Grey Knights is their relationship with the weapons they wield. These are supposed to be the most incorruptible warriors in the Imperium, the shining silver wall between humanity and the horrors of the warp. And yet, their arsenals are absolutely saturated with the kind of tools that, in any other context, would set off alarms across the entire ecclesiarchy. Demon-slaying swords, psychic ammunition, sanctified relics forged in rites so esoteric they might as well be sorcery. And, most controversially of all, weapons made from demon-imbued materials. It's like watching someone preach about purity while holding a knife carved from sin itself. Let's talk about nemesis weapons. They're iconic. Halberds, swords, force staves, all tuned to the psychic signature of their wielder. But they aren't just psychically charged. These weapons are specifically engineered to tear through demonic entities, ripping them apart on a metaphysical level. That alone is heavy stuff. But then you look deeper, and realize that some of these blades are forged using materials that have been in direct contact with the warp. In some cases, they're literally bound with demon essences or sanctified fragments of once corrupted relics. That's where things get murky. Because if purity is their creed, how far can they go before that creed starts to bend? There's a common justification I hear from fans, and honestly, it's the one I used to tell myself, that these weapons are only dangerous in the wrong hands, that the Grey Knights, being utterly immune to corruption, can wield these tools without risk. They're not using the warp, they're turning its power back on itself. It's poetic, right? Like lighting a torch in a demon's fire. But the more I think about it, the more uneasy it makes me. Because when everyone else in the Imperium even touches something tainted, the consequences are immediate and catastrophic. A single corrupted blade can doom an entire planet. A whispered word from a demon can unravel a whole fleet. And yet the Grey Knights are allowed to carry entire arsenals of warp-forged weaponry without question. Not even suspicion. That's not just trust. It's a kind of exemption. A rule made specifically for them. And that's always the danger with exceptions. They start as practicality and end as ideology. One of the most infamous examples is the Titan-smiting Psy-cannon shells they carry, designed to explode with such psychic violence that they can obliterate demonic forms on a molecular level. Effective? Absolutely. But they're also unstable, dangerous to the user, and soaked in rituals that toe the line between sanctity and heresy. It's not that the Grey Knights use these tools that worries me. It's that they need them. That even with all their purity, all their training, they still require weapons steeped in the very energy they claim to reject. And then there's the matter of diamond blades, actual weapons that have been possessed, purified, and reforged for use. That's not just practical, that's symbolic. It's the idea that anything, no matter how tainted, can be repurposed if you're strong enough. But isn't that exactly the kind of thinking that chaos thrives on? The slow, creeping rationalization that leads from rejection to compromise? First you sanctify a demon blade, then you justify keeping it, then you begin to believe it's necessary. Eventually you don't even see the blade as corrupt, you see it as holy. I've read fan theories that suggest this is the real danger of the Grey Knights. Not that they'll fall to chaos, but that they'll redefine it. That they'll become so confident in their immunity that they start to see warp corruption as a tool, not a threat. And when that happens, who decides where the line is drawn? At what point does a holy weapon become a heretical one? Even the ritual forging of their arms and armor carries this eerie duality. Their artificers chant litanies that mix the sacred with the psychic. They perform rites that blur the line between science, faith, and metaphysics. And they do it all in isolation, hidden from the rest of the Imperium, without oversight. How is anyone supposed to know when they've gone too far? Or worse, if they already have? The strangest part is, none of this seems to bother them. The Grey Knights move through this contradiction without hesitation. They don't seem to question the purity of their weapons or the implications of wielding demonically aligned materials. And maybe that's what makes them so dangerous. Not that they're corrupted, but that they can't imagine they could be. There's a kind of pride in that, masked as discipline, a belief that because they're pure, their actions must be pure. And I get it. In a galaxy this brutal, sometimes you don't get to fight clean, but I can't help feeling there's something deeply ironic about a force so obsessed with purity using weapons that, by any other standard, would be considered unforgivable. It's not that they're doing the wrong thing. It's that they've convinced themselves it's the only way. And once you start believing that, you stop asking questions. You stop seeing the compromises. You stop noticing when the line you swore you'd never cross is already behind you. There's this story I heard once about a group of Astra Militarum guardsmen who held the line against a demonic incursion long enough for a Grey Knight strike force to arrive and finish the job. These guardsmen fought bravely, bled for the Imperium, and lived to see the battle won. But they didn't live much longer after that. Because the moment the fighting ended, The Grey Knights turned on them. No trial, no gratitude, just silence, followed by gunfire. Not because the guardsmen had done anything wrong, but because they'd seen. And that's when I realized something chilling. The Grey Knights aren't just warriors. They're keepers of a secret so massive, so dangerous, that even their allies must sometimes be erased to protect it. They call it the Code of Silence, an unspoken, unwritten law that governs every operation, every interaction, every moment of their existence. No one outside the chapter is allowed to know the full truth, not about their weapons, their rituals, their origin, not even their names. And if someone finds out anyway, well, there are ways to handle that. Brutal final ways. To the Grey Knights, secrecy isn't just tactical, it's sacred. It's the foundation of their purity. The less the Imperium knows about them, the less chance there is for corruption to find a foothold. And in theory, that makes sense. But in practice, it starts to look less like discipline and more like fanaticism. There are entire campaigns where the Grey Knights arrived, fought alongside loyal Imperial forces, and then systematically eliminated every survivor. Not because those forces failed, not because they were compromised, but because they knew too much. That's not war, that's doctrine. That's ideology acting without compassion, without room for exceptions. And if that's not cult behavior, I don't know what is. It's honestly one of the hardest things to wrap your head around as a fan. You want to admire them. You want to see them as the last line of defense against chaos. But then you realize that, to them, you are a threat just for being in the room. Their silence isn't just defensive, it's aggressive. It actively pushes others away, isolates them, and builds this image of divine detachment. And what's worse, it's not just physical elimination. Sometimes they use mind-wipe protocols, psychic purges so intense they can erase hours, days, even entire personalities. There are stories of commissars or planetary governors who were cleansed after a Grey Knight intervention, left as shadows of who they once were, still alive, still technically loyal. But something essential had been stripped away, something human. There's a growing theory in the fandom that the Grey Knight's obsession with secrecy is more than just a necessity. It's a compulsion, like a psychological scar embedded in the chapter's culture from day one. Think about it. They were created in the aftermath of the Horus Heresy, when trust had been shattered, when betrayal had nearly destroyed humanity. Their entire existence is a reaction to that trauma, and maybe over the centuries, that reaction calcified into a worldview where any knowledge is dangerous, where anyone outside their brotherhood is a potential leak. So they stopped trusting, then they stopped talking, then they stopped seeing others as worth preserving. What's especially disturbing is how this code twists their relationships with other Imperial forces. They'll fight beside Sisters of Battle, Tempestus Scions, even fellow Astartes, but it's always temporary, always conditional. And the moment the mission ends, the Grey Knights become ghosts again, vanishing into their fortress monastery, leaving only scorched battlefields and unanswered questions. It's like they exist in a different layer of reality, one where connection is weakness and memory is a liability. And of course, there's the symbolic side of all this. The Grey Knights wear no heraldry that reveals their names. They don't take glory for their victories. They don't inscribe personal honors or share their deeds with the galaxy. In a universe obsessed with martyrdom and legend, that's downright eerie. Even the most humble Space Marine chapters take pride in their history. But the Grey Knights, they erase theirs as they go. The only legacy they leave is silence. You start to wonder, who are they really protecting, the Imperium or themselves? Some fans argue that this ruthless code is proof of their purity, that only a force so committed, so detached from ego, could operate without the desire for recognition. But others, myself included, see something darker. Because when an organization starts erasing its witnesses, eliminating its own allies, and cutting itself off from all accountability, that's not purity, that's control. That's the kind of behavior we'd call heresy if it came from any other source. And maybe that's the most dangerous part of all, that we've accepted this behavior, that we've made excuses for it, that we've looked at the trail of silenced voices and called it necessary. Because the moment we start believing that secrecy equals virtue, we open the door for anything to hide behind that silence, even corruption, even rot, even madness. There's no way to talk about the Grey Knights without eventually landing on the myth, the legend, the absolute walking paradox that is Malcador Drago. He's like a living fever dream, cooked up in the most exaggerated corner of Warhammer lore. The supreme Grand Master of the Grey Knights, lost in the warp for centuries, casually carving his name into the heart of a greater demon of Nurgle, and still showing up across the galaxy to lead his chapter at just the right moment. At some point, you stop asking how and start asking why. Why would Games Workshop write a character so over the top that he feels like a parody of heroism? And what does it say about the Grey Knights that this is their ultimate icon? Drago doesn't just bend the rules of reality. He seems to exist entirely outside them. Most Space Marines are bound by the physical world. They live, they fight, they die. But Drago? He walks the Immaterium like it's just another battlefield. He fights demons in their own domain and wins. He escapes the traps of Chaos Gods. He burns demon palaces and slaughters warp beasts that should, by all logic, be untouchable. And then, like some kind of metaphysical boomerang, he reappears in real space just in time to deliver a rousing speech or land the killing blow. And the strangest part? It's not meant to be ironic. The official lore treats it all as canon. No winks, no nods, no sense that maybe we're supposed to take this with a grain of salt. He is what he is. The unbeatable, unbreakable paragon of purity who literally cannot be tainted by the warp, even as he swims in it. Which is a lot. At first glance, it's almost laughable. The kind of character you expect to see in bad fan fiction. Invincible, untouchable, too good to be true. But the more I thought about it, the more I realized that Drago is fan fiction. Not in a derogatory way, but in the sense that he represents the distilled fantasy of the Grey Knights. He's their spiritual endpoint. All the secrecy, all the purity, all the psychic fortitude taken to their most extreme conclusion. If the Grey Knights are a cult, then Drago is their saint, their prophet, their god in the making. It's no wonder the fandom is so divided on him. Some people love Drago for what he represents, a symbol of hope in a universe defined by despair. In a setting where everything eventually falls to corruption or entropy, Drago refuses to break. He defies not only chaos, but the very narrative gravity of the setting. He's the ultimate power fantasy, and in a world this grimdark, maybe we need at least one unshakable hero. But others, myself included, find him unsettling. Not because he's strong, but because of what his existence implies. He doesn't struggle. He doesn't doubt. He doesn't fail. And in a universe that's all about moral ambiguity and the high cost of survival, that kind of perfection feels alien, inhuman, almost authoritarian. Drago doesn't inspire trust so much as awe, and awe, unchecked, turns into worship. That's what makes him feel less like a character and more like a messiah figure, and not in a good way. There's this idea floating around in the community that Drago isn't really a person anymore, that he's a myth given flesh, sustained not by his own will, but by the collective belief of the Grey Knights. Like the Emperor, he's crossed that line from man to symbol. And once someone becomes a symbol, their flaws get erased. Their humanity gets rewritten. Maybe Drago did suffer, maybe he did doubt, but that part of his story got lost, or deliberately buried. And if that's the case, what does it say about the Grey Knights as a whole? Because they've built their culture around him. Statues, litanies, psychic echoes. The very walls of their fortress monastery carry inscriptions of his deeds. When a chapter turns one of their own into a living myth, you're not just looking at hero worship anymore. You're looking at dogma, doctrine, and doctrine doesn't question itself. It doesn't evolve. It just repeats over and over until the ideal matters more than the reality. That's what Drago has become, the embodiment of an ideal that can never be challenged. And in that sense, he's both inspiring and terrifying. Some fans even go further and theorize that Drago might not be real anymore in the traditional sense, that his actions in the warp are more symbolic than literal. Maybe he's become a psychic echo, a walking avatar of the Grey Knight's collective faith, sustained by their belief and their need for a perfect leader. If that's true, then it's no longer about whether he did what the stories say. It's about what the stories mean to those who believe them. And that brings us full circle to the idea of cults. Because what is a cult if not a group of people who shape their entire reality around a single, unquestionable figure? The Grey Knights deny they're anything but pure, rational warriors. But when you elevate a man like Drago to literal mythic status, when you carve his name into the fabric of your culture, when you accept his impossible victories as sacred truth, you've moved beyond discipline. You've entered the realm of worship. So maybe Drago isn't the outlier. Maybe he's the truth of the Grey Knights made visible. A being who fights without compromise, who speaks without doubt, who kills without hesitation, and who expects the same from everyone else. Not a man, not even a hero, but a symbol of what the Grey Knights think they must become to survive. And if that doesn't feel cultish, I don't know what does. If you've spent any time following the different Space Marine chapters, you start to notice patterns. Each one has its quirks. Some are noble and tragic like the Blood Angels, others are savage but honorable like the Space Wolves, or stoic and duty-bound like the Ultramarines. But they all share this core identity. They're warriors first, brothers second, and ultimately human beneath all the genetic enhancements. You see pride, emotion, even moments of vulnerability. There's always this thread of humanity that grounds them. And then you look at the Grey Knights, and it feels like you're staring at something entirely different. It's tempting to say they're just better. That they're what the Adeptus Astartes were always meant to be. Stronger, purer, more psychically attuned, completely immune to corruption. But the more I've compared them to other chapters, the more I've come to believe that better isn't the right word, not even close. The Grey Knights aren't higher or lower on some kind of Space Marine hierarchy. They're operating on a different axis entirely. Take the recruitment process, for example. Most chapters draw from feral worlds or hive cities, picking the toughest kids they can find, putting them through brutal trials, and hoping the gene seed doesn't kill them. It's brutal, but it reflects a kind of grim meritocracy. But the Grey Knights don't just want toughness or aggression. They want psychic potential, not raw power either. Discipline, control. Candidates are handpicked from the Imperium's vast population and taken to Titan, where the process of becoming a Grey Knight is less about surviving physical trials and more about complete mental reconditioning. Other chapters break bones. The Grey Knights break minds and rebuild them. That changes everything. Most Space Marines still retain a sliver of their past. They might remember their homeworld, their family, the moment they were chosen. That memory fuels their identity. It ties them to the Imperium they fight for. The Grey Knights? They bury all of that. Their pasts are erased. They are forged into something new, something singular. And that's what makes them feel so alien, even compared to other Astartes. You can see the difference in how they carry themselves, too. Other chapters have personalities. They chant war cries, paint their armor with symbols of personal honor, and argue with each other about doctrine and tactics. The Space Wolves are practically a family of growling, beer-swilling berserkers. The Dark Angels hide secrets behind layers of stoicism and pride. Even the Ultramarines, for all their regulation and order, still have a sense of tradition and pageantry. The Grey Knights? No bickering, no ceremony, just mission, just purity. Just silence. Some fans say that's what makes them elite, that they've moved beyond the petty flaws of brotherhood and individuality, that while other chapters squabble over honor or past grudges, the Grey Knights remain focused, pure, and effective. And yeah, they are effective. But I don't know if that makes them better, because there's something deeply inhuman about it. No one jokes, no one questions. There are no rivalries, no traditions passed down from veteran to recruit. Just a flat, uniform belief in the mission. And let's talk about faith. Most Space Marines pay lip service to the Emperor. Some, like the Black Templars, take it to the extreme, becoming zealots in powered armor. But even in their fanaticism, there's something relatable. You can see where that passion comes from. The Grey Knights, though? They don't worship the Emperor in the traditional sense. They invoke his name as a psychic weapon, not as a god. Their faith is clinical, tactical. There's no emotion behind it, only precision. That kind of cold devotion feels more like indoctrination than belief. One of the things that always stuck with me is how other chapters react to the Grey Knights. When they meet on the battlefield, there's no camaraderie, no shared brotherhood. It's more like a ceasefire between two nations that barely understand each other. Some Space Marines actually fear the Grey Knights, not because they're stronger, though they are, but because they're unpredictable, remote, unknowable. And in a universe where trust is everything, that's a dangerous quality to have. It reminds me of something I heard a Salamanders player say once, half joking. You can sit by a fire with a salamander, you can drink with a space wolf, you can debate with an ultramarine, but with a Grey Knight, you just hope they leave when the demon's dead. And maybe that's the point. Maybe the Grey Knights were never meant to be part of the Astartes Brotherhood. Maybe they were designed to be outside of it, to be so singularly focused that nothing else matters. But if that's the case, it makes them less like warriors and more like machines. Or worse, like priests of some psychic religion we're not meant to understand. So are they truly superior or just different? The more I look at them, the more I think it's the latter. They aren't the next evolution of Space Marines. They're a different species altogether. Same armor, same physiology, but completely distinct in mind and spirit. Other chapters still cling to fragments of humanity. The Grey Knights cut it out at the root and called it purity. And I don't know about you, but that kind of perfection feels a little too sterile to admire. It doesn't feel like strength. It feels like loss. There's a fine line in the Imperium between belief and obsession, between faith that empowers and fanaticism that devours. And when you look closely at the Grey Knights, that line starts to blur in unsettling ways, because for all their psychic mastery, martial precision, and incorruptible discipline, there's a creeping sense that they don't just fight demons. They define themselves by them. Their entire identity, from recruitment to death, is framed around chaos, not just as an enemy to destroy, but as a mirror to reject, a shadow that gives their light meaning. And when your whole existence is built around opposing something, it's easy to lose track of who you are without it. At first, you think it's just dedication, that these warriors are singular in their purpose and immune to the self-glorification that poisons other branches of the Imperium. But the deeper you dig, the more it starts to feel like something else entirely. Like belief has become dogma. Like the Grey Knights haven't just rejected corruption, they've enshrined their own purity into something sacred, something unquestionable, something worshipped. And in that worship, they've created an ideology so rigid it can't bend without breaking. They don't speak about honor or victory. They speak about duty, purity, silence. Their litanies aren't just for the Emperor or the Imperium. They're reflections of themselves, echoes of their own discipline. It's like they've built a religion not around a god, but around the idea of being the only ones who can stand unflinching before the abyss. The last and only line, the silent brotherhood that never fails, never doubts, never asks questions. And when you repeat that kind of narrative for millennia, it stops being just belief. It becomes self-worship. You see it most clearly in how they view outsiders. The average citizen of the Imperium is a pawn to be protected from the truth. Other Astartes are unreliable, emotional, flawed. Even the Inquisition, their nominal overlords, are kept at arm's length. The only ones the Grey Knights trust are themselves. Not because they're arrogant, not in the traditional sense, but because their training and ideology require it. To question another is to introduce uncertainty, and uncertainty is a crack where corruption might seep through. So they close the ranks, seal the doors, and repeat the mantra: "We are pure, we are faithful, we are the Emperor's will made flesh." But at some point, you have to ask, is that really faith? Or is it a form of pride masquerading as humility? One of the things that fascinates me is how the Grey Knights never allow themselves to be seen as heroes. No monuments, no songs, no recorded deeds. And yet, inside their fortress on Titan, they carve every victory into the walls. They preserve every name. They chant their history like scripture. So who is that reverence for, if not the Imperium? It's for themselves, for each other, the only audience that matters, the only ones allowed to remember. And if that doesn't resemble a closed, self-sustaining belief system, I don't know what does. There's this fan theory that's haunted me ever since I first read it. It suggests that the Grey Knights aren't afraid of chaos corrupting them. They're afraid of realizing they need chaos to justify their existence, that without demons, without the warp, without this eternal burning conflict, they wouldn't know who they are anymore. The purity, the rituals, the silence. It all depends on there being a threat so absolute that their response must be just as absolute. In that way, they're not just fighting the darkness, they're defined by it. And if that's true, then what happens when the line between opposing evil and becoming obsessed with your own righteousness starts to fade? I've seen some fans call it a necessary evolution, that in a galaxy this twisted, the only way to remain pure is to make purity your identity, to believe so completely in your cause that you become untouchable. But others argue, and I think they're onto something, that this kind of closed-loop ideology is exactly how cults are born. When you start treating your beliefs as self-evident truth, when questioning becomes weakness, when ritual replaces reason, you're no longer just resisting evil. You're performing a role, and roles can become cages. The Grey Knights don't celebrate victories. They don't mourn losses. They don't debate doctrine or adjust their tactics based on philosophy. Everything is fixed, eternal. And in a universe as chaotic as the one they inhabit, that rigidity can look like strength. But it can also be a kind of fear. The fear of losing control, of stepping outside the myth they've built around themselves. I don't think they see it, though. I think the myth has become reality, at least to them. They are purity. They are the light in the dark. And so long as they believe that, everything they do is justified. The silence, the secrecy, the weapons made from demon bones, the execution of witnesses, all of it flows naturally from the belief that they alone can stand untainted. But when belief becomes identity, and identity becomes inflexible, you're no longer just resisting corruption. You're sanctifying yourself. You're creating a moral framework where you're always right, because you must be. Because to admit otherwise would mean pulling apart the very foundation of who you are. And that's not strength. That's fragility wrapped in steel. That's not faith. It's fanaticism with better PR. So after all this, the question still lingers. Are the Grey Knights truly pure, or are they just the best hidden cult in the Imperium? It's hard to answer that with any sense of finality because the truth of the Grey Knights is wrapped in contradictions. They are incorruptible psychers who wield the powers of the warp. They are humble warriors who erase all traces of their own existence. They are defenders of mankind who will destroy allies to protect secrets. Every layer you peel back reveals another paradox. And maybe that's the point. Maybe their so-called purity isn't the absence of sin, but the mastery of it. Not to embrace it, not to fall to it, but to know it intimately and use that knowledge without ever blinking. On the surface, yes, they are pure. No Grey Knight has ever fallen to chaos, not once. That alone is a staggering achievement in a setting where everyone, saints, primarchs, inquisitors, eventually breaks. But purity is more than just resisting corruption. It's about intent. It's about transparency. It's about choosing to be good, not just being engineered to be unbreakable. And when you start to examine their behavior, the secrecy, the isolation, the worship of their own myth, you begin to wonder if what they've really done is build a cage so strong that even the truth can't get in. There's a version of the Grey Knights that exists in Imperial propaganda. Shining silver warriors, the ultimate champions of humanity, silent sentinels who appear from nowhere to slay the unholy. But there's another version, the one we've been talking about. A version where purity becomes performance. Where the silence isn't just about protecting humanity. It's about control. Where rituals become identity and identity becomes ideology. The fans are split, as always. Some insist they're the ultimate answer to chaos, a necessary countermeasure born from a universe that offers no middle ground. Others argue that they've become what they were made to fight, a belief system that can no longer question itself. Personally, I think the most terrifying part about the Grey Knights isn't their strength. It's their certainty, their absolute, unshakable belief that what they do is always right. That kind of moral rigidity might keep them from falling to chaos, sure, but it also makes them incapable of recognizing their own blind spots. And in a universe shaped by belief, that's a very dangerous thing. Because when you dig deep enough, you start to see the outlines of a cult, a brotherhood of silent warriors who revere their own code above all else, who venerate mythic heroes like Drago not just as leaders, but as living symbols, who isolate themselves from the very Imperium they're sworn to protect, not out of necessity, but because they no longer trust anyone but themselves. Who carry relics forged from the very darkness they claim to reject, because they believe only they are pure enough to wield them. And that, to me, is where the illusion of purity starts to crack. Maybe they are immune to chaos, but what does that even mean if they've replaced it with a different kind of extremism? A cleaner one, a quieter one, but a form of extremism all the same. A cult doesn't always have to chant in basements or wear strange symbols. Sometimes a cult looks like a fortress on a moon, covered in silver, guarded by silence, and filled with warriors who believe their way is the only way left. But here's the thing, that doesn't make them evil. It doesn't even make them wrong. Maybe in a universe like Warhammer 40K, you need a force like this, something so absolute, so unyielding, that it can hold the line where everything else fails. Maybe their flaw isn't their fanaticism. It's that they're the only ones who know they're not allowed to fail. They were never given the option to be human, only to be weapons. And they've become the best weapons the Imperium has ever created. So are they pure? In their own way, yes. But it's a purity carved out of necessity, reinforced by silence, and maintained by a belief so rigid it can't be broken. Whether that makes them noble or terrifying depends entirely on your perspective. And honestly, I think that's why I can't stop thinking about them, because the Grey Knights aren't just a chapter. They're a mirror, held up to the darkest parts of the Imperium and to ourselves. If you've made it this far, thank you. I know this was a long one, but the Grey Knights are one of the most fascinating enigmas in the entire setting, and I think they deserve to be explored from every angle, not just the heroic, polished version we usually get. If you liked this breakdown and want to hear more deep dives like this, whether it's more lore, character studies, or exploring the darker corners of the Imperium, don't forget to subscribe. Hit that bell so you don't miss the next dive into the weird, the grim, and the unforgettable. Thanks for watching.